I did not open the Sethani file on the day the Institute was dissolved. I did not open it on the day the Bureau formally reclassified the outer designation, which was the same day as it happened. The dissolution order and the reclassification order were signed in the same session, by the same 7 signatories in the same chamber, with the same stylus passed from hand to hand without anyone setting it down on the table between signatures. I remember being told this detail by the records clerk who processed the paperwork. She mentioned it quietly, as though it were a matter of administrative curiosity, rather than the thing it actually was, which was 7 senior bureau officials, unwilling to put the stylus down because putting the stylus down would have required them to sit for a moment in a room that contained the Sethani file. I did not open it that day. I did not open it in the cycle that followed, nor in the 3 cycles after that. I have not opened it in 38 years. I do not intend to open it before this account is complete. And when this account is complete, I will seal it in the archive alongside the Sethani file. And I will not open either of them after that. I am Orvath Nayan. I hold the Senior Archivist designation for the Bureau of Outer Classifications, Vath Osran, and I have held that designation for 41 years. In 41 years, I have read every file the Bureau has ever produced, every record it has ever classified, every petition it has ever received and granted or denied, every sealed notation, every restricted annex, every document that was classified not because its contents were sensitive, but because the individual who authored it requested privacy, which the Bureau grants as a matter of course to authors of minor survey reports and internal correspondence. I have read all of it. I have read, at one time or another, every document in this archive. The archive contains 417,000 individual classified documents. I have read all of them. I have not read the Sethani file. This is not because I am prohibited from reading it. I am not prohibited. I hold the Senior Archivist designation. There is no restriction code in this building that applies to me and not to the Bureau Director, and the Bureau Director read the file on the day of dissolution. I know this because she countersigned the reclassification order, and her signature protocol requires the countersigning official to attest that she has reviewed the primary evidence. She reviewed it. She countersigned. She retired from the Bureau 14 days later, citing reasons of personal health, which the Bureau accepted without question. Because the Bureau does not ask certain questions. Whether her health was genuinely the cause of her retirement, or whether she simply could not bear to come back to a building that contained the file she had reviewed is a question that belongs in the same category as the questions the Bureau does not ask. I have not read the full file because I know what is in it, not from having read it in some other form, and not from anything anyone told me directly. I know what is in it because I know what the Sethani Institute submitted in its original petition, which I did read. I know what the survey fleet carried in terms of instrumentation and crew, which is in the fleet manifest, which I did read. I know which vessels returned, and which did not, which is in the transit log, which I did read. I know that the Bureau's medical division sealed all crew assessments from the 8 returned vessels within 6 hours of those vessels' arrival at the Vath Osran transit point, which is in the medical division's operational log, which records the sealing action without recording its contents. And I know that one member of the crew of one of the returned vessels gave a recorded statement of 7 sentences before the recording was terminated. I have read the 7 sentences. That is everything I know directly. The rest I know by the shape of what the Bureau did after the fleet returned, and the shape of what it did not do, and the shape of the gap between the Sethani Institute petition and the reclassification order that followed was not the reclassification the Institute had petitioned for. In 41 years of working with classified documents, I have learned that shape is often more informative than content. What an institution does not say, and what it does instead of saying it, and the speed at which it acts on a thing it claims not fully to understand. These are a form of record too. I read them the same way I read anything else. I will begin where the Bureau's record begins. I will tell you what the record contains, and I will tell you what the record implies. And I will tell you the 7 sentences in the position the Bureau assigned them, because that is the position they deserve. And because a true account cannot be shaped by what is comfortable to include. The Sethani Institute was a body of academic cartographers and classification theorists attached to the University of Vathasran under a joint charter with the Bureau. It had existed for 63 years at the time of the petition. Its stated purpose in its founding charter was the systematic analysis of outer margin designations, the formal labels applied by the Bureau to regions of space beyond the surveyed frontier, with the goal of refining the Bureau's classification methodology and correcting designations that the evidence no longer supported. In 63 years, the Institute had submitted 41 petitions to the Bureau. 40 of those petitions were granted. The one that was denied, the 37th, submitted in the Institute's 44th year, was denied on procedural grounds, not evidentiary ones, and was resubmitted with the procedural deficiencies corrected and granted in the following cycle. Every other petition was granted on the first submission, and most were granted quickly. The Bureau trusted the Institute's methodology. The Bureau trusted its rigor. The Bureau had reason to. In 63 years, the Institute had successfully reclassified 11 outer margin designations. In every case, its surveys had been thorough, its evidence compelling, and its conclusions supported by independent review. In 7 of the 11 cases, the Bureau's own cartographic division had subsequently commended the Institute's work as a model of classification practice. The Institute's researchers had won academic awards. Its director had been invited to address the Bureau's Oversight Council on 4 separate occasions. The Institute's name, in the Bureau's institutional culture, was synonymous with careful, credible, evidence-based scholarship. All of this is in the archive. I have read all of it. I am including it because it is necessary context for understanding what happened, and because the people who built the Institute, who dedicated careers to it, who trained under it, trusted it, deserve to have the record show what it was before it ended. I have been the custodian of this archive for 41 years, and in 41 years I have written many accounts of many records, and I have never begun an account by establishing the quality of the thing I was about to describe being destroyed. I am doing it now because I want the shape of what was lost to be legible before I describe the losing of it. The Sethani Institute was not a reckless body. It was not arrogant, in the sense that word is sometimes used to describe entities that approach forbidden things without respect for the prohibition. It had 41 years of successful, rigorous, carefully documented scholarship behind its petition. It had a perfect record. It understood the classification system it was asking to revise better than almost any outside body in the Bureau's history. If any institution had the expertise and the credibility and the careful methodology to approach this particular question safely, it was the Sethani Institute. I am saying this not to excuse what happened. I am saying it because the record must show that the failure, if it is a failure, and I am not certain that word applies, was not a failure of carefulness. The Institute was careful. The Bureau was careful. The modifications were imposed carefully. The survey was conducted carefully. Every step was documented, reviewed, logged, verified. Every person involved did the work the way the work was meant to be done. And at the outer margin of the buffer zone, in the spectral data of a survey fleet operating exactly where they had been approved to operate, there was a notation in a formatting convention they would not develop until 3 days into the survey. Careful does not mean safe. I have learned that from this record. I have learned it from the 7 sentences. Careful means that you documented what happened to you thoroughly enough that the person who reads the record afterward understands exactly what you did and exactly how little it mattered that you did it correctly. The 42nd petition was submitted in the Institute's 61st year. It was by any measure the most ambitious petition the Institute had ever filed. It ran to 412 pages of evidentiary summary, 8 volumes of supporting data, and a 12-page executive argument that the Bureau's senior officials described, in their internal correspondence, as the most coherent and compellingly constructed reclassification case they had ever reviewed. That assessment is in the archive. I have read it. I include it because the Bureau's own officials said it, and because the record should show that the people who made the decision to approve the survey were not credulous or incautious. They were experienced. They read the petition carefully. They debated it for 4 months. They imposed conditions on the approval. They thought they were being careful. The petition argued for the reclassification of designation Orithvean. I want to be precise about what designation Orithvean was. It was one of 11 outer margin designations applied by the Bureau to regions of space beyond the surveyed frontier. Of the 11, 9 carried standard restricted approach classifications. The restrictions existed because those regions had not been fully surveyed, because survey conditions were hazardous, because the regions contained resources or features of potential strategic value that the Bureau wished to assess before permitting general access. 2 of the 11 carried a different classification entirely. They were not restricted approach. They were forbidden approach. Designation Orithvean was one of those 2. A forbidden approach designation is not a survey restriction. It is not a resource protection measure. A forbidden approach designation means that the Bureau has reviewed the available evidence about a region and concluded that approach constitutes an unacceptable institutional risk, not a risk that can be mitigated by better equipment or more careful protocols, but a fundamental categorical risk that the Bureau is not willing to expose its personnel or its member species to under any circumstances it can currently foresee. The distinction between a restricted approach designation and a forbidden approach designation is not a matter of degree. They are categorically different assessments. In the Bureau's history, a forbidden approach designation had been applied 6 times. Of those 6, 4 had been subsequently reclassified as the underlying conditions changed. Survey conditions improved, resources were assessed, the risk declined to manageable levels, or new instrumentation demonstrated that the original concern had been based on misread data. 2 remained. They had remained for a long time. The second forbidden approach designation had been in place for 480 years. Designation Orithvean had been in place for 317. The Sethani Institute's petition argued that Orithvean's forbidden approach status was a classification artifact. That was the word it used, artifact. The argument was extensive and carefully structured, and I will summarize it here because the summary matters for what follows. The forbidden approach designation had been applied to Orithvean 317 years ago. Officials, who were themselves responding to reports and accounts from explorers and survey teams whose instrumentation and methodology were, by modern standards, severely limited. The original designation was based not on direct evidence of a categorical risk, but on a pattern of non-return. Vessels that had entered the region had not come back, and the Bureau of that era had classified the non-return as evidence of a risk without adequately accounting for alternative explanations. The original investigators had done the best they could with what they had. Their concern was reasonable given their tools. The problem was not that they were wrong to designate the region. The problem was that the designation had been maintained for 3 centuries on the basis of their assessment, without the assessment itself being revisited because no one had submitted a petition for review. The alternative explanations the Institute proposed for the pattern of non-return were several and carefully considered. Equipment failure consistent with the navigational hazards known to exist in the outer margin. Communication blackout zones created by the region's particular spectral density, which would explain the absence of transmissions without requiring any active cause. Simple navigational error, compounded by the inadequacy of period instrumentation, resulting in vessels that were not lost to the region, but simply unable to find their way back without modern navigation tools. The Institute did not claim that any of these explanations was definitively correct. It claimed that they were plausible, that they had not been ruled out, and that a modern survey with modern instrumentation was the only means by which they could be evaluated. The Institute's central claim was this: 317 years is a long time. Instrumentation, methodology, and understanding advance. A designation applied on the basis of limited evidence under the classification standards of a period we now recognize as technically primitive is not evidence. It is the record of a concern. Concerns deserve to be revisited. The Institute was asking for the means to revisit it. The proposed survey methodology was detailed and specific. 11 vessels, fully instrumented with the Bureau's most current spectral, gravitational, and navigational analysis equipment. The fleet would not enter Orthvayan's designated zone. It would operate at the outer margin of the buffer zone, established around the designated zone. A distance of 11 standard navigational units, beyond the formal boundary, collecting data from the boundary region itself. The survey would last 40 standard days, allowing for comprehensive multi-spectrum analysis across a complete transit cycle of the nearest significant gravitational body in the region. The Bureau's response took 4 months. This was unusual. The Bureau's standard response time for a petition of this complexity was 6 to 8 weeks. I have read the internal correspondence from those 4 months. The delay was not procedural. The Bureau's senior officials were debating the petition in earnest, reading it, contesting it among themselves, requesting independent analyses from the Cartographic Division and from 2 external academic bodies who were not affiliated with the Institute. The external analyses both concluded that the Institute's methodology was sound. The Cartographic Division's analysis concluded that the proposed survey, within the outer buffer zone, was operationally feasible under the Bureau's current safety protocols. Response, when it came, was a conditional grant. The Bureau approved the survey with 2 modifications. The survey vessels would not operate at the boundary of Orthvayan's designated zone. They would operate at the outer margin of the buffer zone's outer margin, a distance 11 navigational units further out than what the Institute had requested, meaning approximately 22 navigational units beyond the formal boundary, and the survey would last 20 standard days, not 40. The modifications were significant. The distance change meant the fleet would be farther from the boundary than the Institute's methodology required for its most important measurements. The duration change meant that incomplete data was a real possibility. The Bureau's internal correspondence shows that the officials who proposed these modifications knew they were degrading the survey's scientific value. They imposed them anyway. This is worth noting. Experienced officials, reviewing a petition they considered the most compellingly constructed reclassification case they had ever seen, chose to degrade its scientific value rather than allow the full survey parameters. I have read those correspondence files closely. I have tried to find in them the logic of the modifications, the specific concern, the named risk, the reason one set of parameters was acceptable and another was not. I have not found it explicitly stated. What I find instead is a quality in the language of those correspondence files that I do not find in other Bureau correspondence from the same period. It is a quality I would describe, if asked, as discomfort with precision. When the Bureau's officials discussed the modifications in their correspondence, they did not say, "We are reducing the proximity because of risk X," they said. The outer margin parameters seem more appropriate for an initial survey of this nature. The word they used most often was prudent. It seems prudent to begin at a greater distance. It seems prudent to limit the initial survey duration. A shorter initial survey seems prudent given the designation's history. Prudent is not a technical term. It is a judgment. It is what officials write when they know something they cannot fully articulate. It's what people write when their instinct is telling them something their evidence cannot support. I have spent a considerable amount of time in 41 years thinking about what the Bureau's officials knew in those 4 months. They knew the petition's argument. They knew the alternative explanations the Institute had proposed for the historical pattern of non-return. They had read the external analyses, which found the methodology sound. They knew all of that, and they still imposed the modifications, and they still described their reasoning in the language of prudence rather than specificity. There is one document in the correspondence from those 4 months that you return to more often than the others. It is a private internal note. Not an official communication, not a formal memorandum, but a note, written by the Bureau's senior classification officer to himself, found in the margin of his copy of the petition's executive argument, and transcribed into the archive's record of his working papers after his death. He wrote it in the 3rd week of the Bureau's deliberation, before the modifications had been formally proposed. The note is 9 words long. The 9 words are, It has been very patient for a long time. He did not explain what he meant. He crossed it out immediately. You can see from the archive's transcription that the crossing out was done in the same writing session, the ink still wet, when he drew the line through it. He did not mention it in any subsequent correspondence. Shh. Whatever thought produced those 9 words, he decided in the same moment that it was not a thought he wanted in his record. Think about those 9 words often. I think about what a senior classification officer, in the middle of a careful bureaucratic deliberation about an outer margin designation, meant by the word patient. I think about what implied subject those 9 words had. What it was, the thing he believed had been patient. I think about the fact that he was one of the officials who proposed the modification reducing the survey's proximity from the boundary, and that his specific contribution to the language of that modification was the word prudent, which appears in the official correspondence in his handwriting. He knew something. He did not put it in the record. He put it in a margin note and then crossed it out, and then he used the word prudent instead, and the Bureau approved the survey with the modifications. And the survey fleet departed on the 42nd day of the 3rd quarter, and 11 vessels went out and 8 came back. The Institute accepted the modifications. In its acceptance letter, which is in the archive, the Institute's director noted that the modified parameters were more conservative than the Institute had hoped, but that the data gathered from the outer buffer margin would be sufficient to assess several of the key evidentiary questions the petition had raised, and that the Institute anticipated returning to the Bureau with a follow-up petition for a boundary zone survey once the initial data had been reviewed. She was already thinking past the first survey. She had already written the follow-up petition in her mind. She had plans for what came after. I know her name. I am not going to use it. She is in the dissolution record, and her name is accessible to anyone with standard Bureau access. But this account is mine, and in my account she is the Institute's director, which is the last position she held before the Institute ceased to exist. And that is enough. I think it is, in its way, the more accurate designation for what she was. The Sethani survey fleet departed Vath Osran on the 42nd day of the 3rd quarter. 11 vessels, carrying 168 crew members in total, of whom 47 were academic researchers attached to the Institute, 61 were survey technicians provided by the Bureau's operational division, and 60 were navigators, engineers, and support personnel contracted through the university's Research Operations Office. The fleet manifest is in the archive. I have read it. I know all 168 names. I read them once on the morning of the day I read the transit log, and I have not read them again since then, because reading them once seemed to be the correct thing to do, and reading them more than once seemed like it would become something else. The fleet's projected transit time to the outer buffer margin was 16 days. The survey was to begin on day 17 and conclude on 37. With the fleet returning to Vath Osran by day 53, on day 51, 8 of the 11 vessels arrived at the Vath Osran transit point. 3 did not. I want to be precise about what "did not arrive" means in the context of Bureau transit records, because precision here matters. It does not mean the 3 vessels were lost in transit between the survey zone and Vath Osran. The Bureau's transit tracking system maintains positional contact with all registered vessels throughout their journey, at standard 6-hour intervals, and that positional data is logged continuously. I have read the transit log for the Sethani fleet. All 11 vessels departed together. All 11 traveled together for 16 days. All 11 arrived at the outer buffer margin on day 17 and began the survey operations. The transit log has positional entries for all 11 vessels through day 22. The entries are routine. Positional coordinates updated at 6-hour intervals, survey status notations, equipment readings flagged for the research record. Nothing anomalous. Day 23, 3 vessels are recorded as having altered course. The log entry is routine in format. A standard course change notation, the vessel designations, the new heading, the logged reason for the course change. The logged reason, in the standard field that navigators use for such notations, reads, Survey parameter adjustment, that is all. Survey parameter adjustment, routine notation indicating that the vessels had decided, within the scope of the approved survey, to adjust their operational positioning. 24. Those 3 vessels are not in the log. Their positional transponders return no signal at the 6-hour update interval. The log records this as a transponder anomaly, which is the standard notation for a vessel that has moved beyond communication range. It is used when a vessel travels behind a large gravitational body or when it enters a region of known communication interference, when a technical fault has interrupted transponder function. It is, in the Bureau's log convention, a neutral notation. It does not indicate a problem, it indicates absence. On day 37, the 8 remaining vessels concluded the survey and departed for Vath Osran. The survey data was secured in the research archive of each vessel's data system. The senior researcher on the lead vessel composed a preliminary findings notation in the survey log, which is in the archive. I have read it. Preliminary findings notation is 31 words long. It does not describe what the survey found. It says that the survey was completed within the approved parameters, that the data was secured, and that a full analysis would be submitted to the Bureau in the standard reporting period following the fleet's return. 31 words. 47-member research team that had spent 20 days conducting the most significant survey of a forbidden approach designation in 3 centuries. The standard preliminary findings notation for a 20-day survey of this instrumentation density typically runs 4 to 6 pages. I have compared it against 23 other survey preliminary findings notations from the Bureau's records. The shortest, prior to this one, 14 pages, 31 words. On day 51, the 8 vessels arrived. They were met at the transit point by Bureau officials and a full medical team from the Bureau's Operational Health Division. Standard arrival protocol for a survey fleet is a transit registration and a docking assignment. The full medical team deployment, including 4 senior medical assessors and 28 support technicians, all carrying containment equipment, was, according to the Operational Health Division's log, requested personally by the Bureau Director, which means she had received information before the fleet arrived. Not from the transit log, which would not have given her enough, something the returned vessels transmitted in the final approach leg. A communication that is not preserved in any log I have found. Or something. The lead vessel's senior researcher communicated to Bureau Control in a channel outside the standard survey log system. Whatever she received, she had the full medical team deployed before the fleet docked. All 109 crew members of the 8 returned vessels were placed in individual medical assessment immediately upon docking. They were not permitted to speak with one another during the assessment period. The Medical Division's operational log notes this as a standard isolation protocol for crews returning from outer margin surveys, justified by the prevention of cross-contamination of account data. This is a real protocol. The Bureau uses it on outer margin returns, but it is not typically enforced with the degree of separation that the operational log describes for this deployment. Separate rooms, no shared spaces, no auditory contact. The isolation described in this operational log is more complete than any other isolation protocol I have found in the Bureau's records for any survey return in the past 200 years. The assessments lasted 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, all assessment records were sealed under a classification that requires 2 senior Bureau officials to countersign any access request. In 38 years, no access request has been submitted. At the 3-hour mark of the assessment period, 1 crew member was assessed as being in a condition that required immediate transfer to the Bureau's restricted medical facility on the lower levels of the archive complex. The operational log records the transfer without specifying the condition. Crew member's name is not in the operational log. The operational log refers to them as subject of interest, which is a classification notation I had never seen before in any Bureau document, and which I suspect was invented on the spot, because no existing notation was adequate. That crew member gave a recorded statement at the 5-hour mark. The statement lasted approximately 4 minutes. Contains 7 sentences. After the 7th sentence, the recording was terminated by the assessing official. The statement was classified at the highest restriction level the Bureau possesses. At the time of recording, the 7 sentences were appended to the Sathani file, which was compiled in the 48 hours that followed and sealed as a single document. I have read the 7 sentences. Before I tell you what they say, I will tell you what happened in those 48 hours and in the days and weeks that followed, because those events are part of the record, and the record must be complete. The Bureau Director met with the 7-member Senior Oversight Council the morning after the fleet's arrival. That session is recorded in the Council's standard minutes. Though the minutes are in the Sathani file, the session lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. At the end of it, the Council produced 4 documents, and they produced them in that session. In 4 hours and 11 minutes, without adjournment, without consultation with outside bodies, without any of the procedural delays that typically accompany decisions of this institutional magnitude. That speed is itself information. When a body that typically deliberates for months acts in 4 hours, it is because what it has been told does not require deliberation. It requires response. The first document was the dissolution order for the Sathani Institute. The dissolution was immediate and unconditional. The Institute's charter was revoked, effective the date of the order. Its facilities were transferred to the university under a general research designation, with the single condition that no research conducted under the new designation could include any study or petition relating to any outer, margin forbidden approach designation or any successor classification to such a designation. The Institute's senior staff were transferred to other Bureau-affiliated academic positions. 47 academic researchers who had been on the survey fleet were reassigned to positions in established research institutions within the inner systems. I have read the reassignment orders. They describe the reassigned as career advancement opportunities. Is the language the Bureau uses for mandatory reassignments that cannot be publicly justified in other terms. The director of the Sathani Institute was transferred to a records review position in the Bureau's historical archive, on the far side of Vath Osran, as far from the operational archive as it was possible to be while remaining within the Bureau's administrative structure. I met her once, at a Bureau function, in the 7th year of her time there. She was present because all Bureau-affiliated academic staff were invited, and she was still technically Bureau-affiliated. She spoke with several of the senior archivists, myself included, about the historical archives collections. The collection is extensive and genuinely interesting. She described it with care and specificity. She knew it well by then, and she clearly valued the work. At one point, someone asked her a polite question about what had brought her to historical records after years in outer margin classification. She paused before answering. The pause was not long, but it was complete. A full stop, not a hesitation. Then, she said that the historical archive contained everything the Bureau understood, and that understanding things fully seemed, to her, the right kind of work. I think about that answer. I have thought about it for 31 years. She retired from the historical archive 11 years after the transfer, citing personal reasons, which the Bureau accepted. Do not know what she did after that. I have not looked. Some records are better left unread by people who still have work to do. The second document produced by the Oversight Council was the reclassification order for designation Orith Vayan. The reclassification was not, as the Institute had petitioned, a downgrade from forbidden approach to restricted approach. It was the opposite. The Bureau established a new classification tier above forbidden approach, a tier that had not previously existed in the Bureau's taxonomy, and it applied that new tier to designation Orith Vayan effective immediately. The new tier has no formal name. Names in classification taxonomy imply a category that might be applied to other things. The Bureau did not want a named category. It wanted a notation, a single character, in the Bureau's classification system that does not correspond to any other designation, that is not defined anywhere in the Bureau's published methodology documentation, and that appears in no document other than the reclassification order for designation Orith Vayan and the header of the Sathani file. I know the character. I see it every day in the archives index, in the header field of the Sathani file. I do not know what it was intended to convey beyond its uniqueness, which is itself a form of communication. When you create a new tier in a taxonomy because no existing tier is sufficient, you are saying something about the thing you are classifying. You are saying that it does not belong in any category you already have. You are saying that you built the category for it, and that you hope, and, I suspect, intend, never to use it for anything else. They have not used it for anything else. In 38 years, the character has appeared in one document and one header. Designation Orithvean occupies a classification tier that is unique to it. Tier above every other category the Bureau uses. Above the forbidden approach designation that was itself above all other approach restrictions. Whatever the Council learned from the survey, from the 7 sentences, from the sealed assessments, the 31-word preliminary findings notation, from whatever the Bureau Director received in that final approach transmission. It was not information that fit into anything the Bureau already had. The third document was an operational directive to the Bureau's Transit Authority, establishing a new exclusion zone around designation Orithvean. The original buffer zone, the 11 navigational units the Bureau had approved as the survey's operating margin, was replaced. The new exclusion zone extends 240 navigational units beyond the formal boundary of designation Orithvean in all directions. For reference, 240 navigational units is approximately the distance from Vathosren, the nearest established outer margin station. It is not a survey restriction. It is not a buffer. It is a distance calculated to ensure that nothing operating within the Bureau's charter range can approach designation Orithvean without first crossing a boundary that is monitored, flagged, and logged. The practical effect is that designation Orithvean is not merely designated forbidden. It is surrounded by a volume of space so large that approaching it requires a deliberate course, a sustained commitment, and enough time that no one could claim they arrived there by accident. The fourth document was a directive to the Bureau's Live Atlas system. The Bureau maintains a Live Atlas, a continuously updated cartographic record of all designated regions, all survey zones, all approach restrictions, and all classification changes. It is the most comprehensive spatial record in the Bureau's possession, updated in real time by the Cartographic Division as new information is received. Every member species of the Bureau's charter has access to the Live Atlas at the level appropriate to their classification clearance. The fourth document directed the Cartographic Division to update the Live Atlas entry for designation Orithvean to reflect the new classification tier, the new exclusion zone, and a marginal notation. The formal notation the Bureau uses to indicate that an entry has additional context, classified above the current viewer's clearance level, indicating that the full record for designation Orithvean was restricted. Cartographic Division received the directive. It prepared the updated entry according to the document specifications, submitted the updated entry to the Live Atlas system for integration on the morning following the session. The Live Atlas system returned the submission with a status notation the Cartographic Division had not seen before. The notation indicated that the entry for designation Orithvean had already been updated. The Cartographic Division reviewed the current entry. It had been updated correctly, with all 4 elements specified in the Bureau's directive. The new classification tier, the new exclusion zone, the marginal notation, and one additional element that the Bureau's directive had not specified. The formal boundary of designation Orithvean in the Live Atlas had been moved, not reduced, extended. The new boundary, the one already recorded in the Live Atlas before the Cartographic Division submitted its update, is approximately 14 navigational units further out in one specific directional sector than the previous formal boundary had been. The extension covers precisely the portion of the outer buffer margin in which the Sithani survey fleet had conducted its operacies 17 through 37. No Bureau official had updated the boundary. No Cartographic Division staff had updated the boundary. The Live Atlas Systems update log, which records every modification to every entry, including the time of modification, the source terminal, and the authorization code of the individual who submitted the modification, shows the boundary update as having been made from a source terminal that does not exist in the Bureau's terminal registry. The authorization code attached to the update is not in the Bureau's authorization code system. The timestamp on the update is 11 days before the Sithani fleet departed Vath Osran. 11 days before the Sithani fleet left port, boundary of designation Orith Vayan was updated in the live atlas to encompass the precise portion of space in which the Sithani survey would subsequently operate. The update was accurate. It correctly anticipated where the survey fleet would go and incorporated that space into the designated boundary. It used an authorization code no Bureau system recognizes. It came from a terminal no Bureau system can locate. The cartographic division reported this to the Bureau director. She reviewed the update log. She did not order an investigation. She did not order the update reversed. She instructed the cartographic division to accept the updated boundary as the current formal boundary of designation Orith Vayan and to ensure that the live atlas reflected it accurately. She issued no explanation of this instruction, was itself unusual. The Bureau Director's instructions typically include a brief justification for the record. This one did not. The updated boundary has been in the live atlas ever since. It is the boundary from which the new exclusion zone is measured. It is the boundary that all member species of the Bureau's charter see when they access the atlas entry for designation Orith Vayan. And it is the boundary that the Sethani Institute's survey fleet had been working within on the last recorded days of the 3 missing vessels' operational logs. No petition has been submitted about the boundary update. No academic body has filed a review request. No institution has queried the origin of the source terminal or the authorization code. The Bureau accepted the boundary and has governed by it for 38 years, and the Bureau's institutional culture, in the years since the dissolution, has developed a quality I would describe as a thorough, well-maintained incuriosity about designation Orith Vayan. Questions are not asked. Queries are not submitted. The entry is visible in the live atlas, accessible to anyone with standard clearance, and no one opens it for longer than it takes to confirm that the designation is above their clearance level. I have not submitted a query about the boundary update. I have thought about it. In 41 years, I have had many opportunities to think carefully about what I would and would not ask the Bureau systems to retrieve for me, and I have thought about this particular question at length, and I have decided not to ask it. And I have not examined my decision too closely, because I am fairly certain that what I would find if I examined it closely is the same conclusion the Bureau Director reached when she looked at the update log and chose not to order an investigation. She knew enough. Knowing more was not something she was willing to do, and she had read the 7 sentences, and I have read the 7 sentences, and I understand her position in a way I did not fully understand it when I first read the log of her decision 11 years ago. The Sethani Institute wanted to deny that the forbidden sane approach designation was a classification artifact. It argued that the Bureau had applied a label to a region of space based on fear and inference rather than evidence, and that a modern survey would demonstrate the label to be unsupported. A label. These are not the actions of an institution that conducted a survey and found nothing. These are the actions of an institution that conducted a survey and found something it could not classify in a region that had already updated its own record to indicate it knew the survey was coming. There is one more element of the aftermath I have not yet described, because it belongs after all the 4 documents rather than alongside them, because it is the element I think about most often when I sit at my desk in the early hours of the morning before anyone else has arrived. In the quiet that the archive has at that time of day, when the only sound is the climate system maintaining the conditions the documents require. On the day after the council session, the day the cartographic division discovered that the live atlas entry for designation Orith Vayan had already been updated, the Bureau Director asked to see the transit log for the Sethani fleet. She had already seen it. She had read it in the initial briefing. She asked to see it again, specifically the entry for day 23. The course change notation. The logged reason. Survey parameter adjustment. She read it. She asked the Transit Authority Coordinator, who was present, who would have made that log entry. The coordinator explained the standard process. The notation would have been made by the navigation officer on the lead vessel. at the time of the course change, following standard notation protocol. The logged reason would be what the navigation officer entered in the reason field. The bureau director asked whether the navigation officer of the lead vessel was among the returned crew members. Coordinator confirmed that she was. She was an individual assessment. The bureau director did not ask to speak with her. She read the notation again, set the transit log down, and ended the meeting. I know this because the transit authority coordinator wrote it in a personal log entry that evening. He submitted to the Bureau's Voluntary Experience Documentation Program, a program that invites Bureau staff to record significant, professional experiences for the Institutional Memory Archive. He submitted it. It was accepted and filed. I found it in the course of a routine archive review 6 years into my tenure. It is not classified. It is in the General Institutional Memory Collection, accessible with standard clearance. He wrote. She read it twice and put it down. She looked like someone who had just confirmed a thing she had hoped was wrong. Survey parameter adjustment. That is what the navigation officer of the lead vessel entered in the roof field when 3 of the 11 survey ships altered course on day 20. 3. Survey parameter adjustment. A routine notation. The kind of entry you make when the survey has found something worth investigating and you are moving your vessel to get a better look. The kind of entry that communicates to anyone reading the log afterward that a decision was made, within the scope of the approved survey, to adjust the fleet's operating configuration. She had hoped it was wrong. She had read it again, hoping it meant something else. It did not mean something else. I will tell you the 7 sentences now. I am reproducing them in full, here, in this account, because this is the only account that will contain them outside the sealed file, and because a complete account requires them. And because in 41 years, I have never produced an incomplete account of anything in this archive, and I am not going to begin with this one. The subject of interest gave the following recorded statement at the 5-hour mark of the assessment, period. I will reproduce each sentence with the numbering the Bureau assigned, because the Bureau assigned numbering to them, which means the Bureau considered their sequence significant, and the Bureau's sense of what is significant has, in 41 years, never been wrong about anything that mattered. First sentence. The 3 vessels changed course because the survey found something at the outer margin of the buffer zone, not a physical obstruction, a notation in the data, a notation in the spectral record at the outer edge of the survey grid that we could not have put there because it was in a formatting from convention, did not develop until the 3rd day of the survey. I want to pause on that sentence, because it is the sentence I return to most often. The survey fleet arrived at the outer buffer margin on day 17. They developed the spectral formatting convention they would use for their analysis on day 19, the 3rd day of the survey. The notation they found in the spectral record used that convention. The notation was there before they developed the convention. Whatever placed the notation in the spectral record knew, before the survey fleet had begun its work, what convention the fleet would develop to record it. Second sentence. The notation indicated a boundary, not the formal Bureau boundary, a different boundary, closer in, inside the outer buffer margin, inside the space the Bureau had approved the survey to operate in. Whatever the notation indicated as a boundary was not the space the Bureau's formal designation covered. It was a different boundary, one not in any Bureau record prior to the survey, one that placed the outer edge of the survey fleet's approved operating zone inside the designated region rather than outside it. Third sentence. The 3 vessels went to look at it. I have read this sentence 11 times in 11 years. It is the simplest sentence of the 7, and the one I find most difficult to sit with. They went to look at it. Not because they were reckless, not because they ignored the designation. They were conducting a survey of the outer buffer margin, and they found a notation in the data, and the notation indicated something they had not expected, and they were scientists, and they went to look at it. It is exactly what the Sathani Institute was designed to do. It is exactly what won successful petitions and 63 years of rigorous scholarship had trained them to do. They found an unexpected data feature, and they moved to examine it. That is not a failure of judgment. That is the discipline the Institute had spent its entire existence building. Fourth sentence. What the three vessels found at the boundary indicated by the notation was a second notation. Fifth sentence. The second notation was addressed. I want to be precise about what addressed means in the context of a spectral data notation in outer margin survey records. It means the notation was not a general marker, it was directed. A notation can mark a region, indicate a feature, flag a boundary. An address notation is sent to something specific. It has a recipient. The second notation found by the three vessels at the boundary indicated by the first notation was not a marker. It was a communication to someone, or something specifically. Sixth sentence. I was not on one of the three vessels. The subject of interest was on one of the 8 vessels that returned. They were not on the 3 that went to examine the second notation. They do not know, therefore, from direct experience, what the address said. But they know it existed, which means at some point, on day 23, when the 3 vessels changed course, or before that, the information about what the 3 vessels had found was communicated to the full fleet. The 8 vessels that returned knew there was an addressed second notation before the 3 vessels moved to examine it, or they learned it from communication during the approach. The subject of interest knew it existed. Seventh sentence. I do not know what the address said. That is where the recording ends. The assessing official terminated it at that point. The statement was classified. The file was sealed. In 41 years it has been accessed once, by me, in the course of routine verification. I said earlier that the file opens itself once every standard cycle. And I want to correct that now, before I close this account, because I want this account to be precise about everything, including my own errors of expression. The Sethani file does not open itself. The Sethani file is a static classified document. What updates, once per standard cycle, is the live atlas entry for designation Orithvayan. Specifically, the marginal notation on that entry that indicates additional context is classified above the viewer's clearance level. The notation is resubmitted, identically in content, but with an updated timestamp, from the same unregistered external source terminal. The atlas accepts it and logs it, and the cartographic division notes it in its maintenance records, and no one submits a query. This has occurred every standard cycle for 38 years. The cartographic division investigated the update source in the first 2 cycles after the reclassification, found no error in the atlas software, and no scheduled maintenance action that would explain it, concluded that the updates were consistent with an external submission, recommended investigation of the source, and received a directive from the bureau director to accept the updates and close the investigation. Since then, the updates have been logged without action. I have been aware of this for 31 years. I became aware of it when I read the cartographic division's investigation record in the course of a routine archive review. In the 10th year of my tenure, I noted it. I did not submit a query about it. I added a flag to my personal archive review schedule to check the entry once per cycle. I have done so for 31 years. The content has not changed. The timestamp updates. The notation is re-identical. Something is maintaining the entry. Something is ensuring that the marginal notation on designation Orithvayan's live atlas record is always current, always accurate, always correctly indicating that there is more here than you are cleared to see. I am including this in the account because it is part of the record, and I am a complete recorder. I said I was recording this account now, in the 41st year of my tenure, rather than at some earlier point, and I should explain why the timing is now, rather than 10 years ago or 20. 3 weeks ago, the cartographic division sent me a maintenance flag, not the regular update cycle notification. Those go to the cartographic division's own record system, not to me directly. This was a different flag, generated by the archive's document integrity monitor, which tracks the physical and data integrity of all documents in the collection, and alerts the senior archivist when a document's status changes. The Sethani file's status had changed, not the classification, not the contents, the status field, an administrative field that records the document's physical and data condition, its location in the archive's storage system, and its last verified integrity date, had been updated. The update added a notation to the status field. The notation is 2 characters in length. Neither character is in the Bureau's notation system. They are not characters I recognize from any classification taxonomy, any cartographic convention, any administrative protocol, or an alienation system I have encountered in 41 years of working in this archive. I had the notation analyzed by the Bureau's Linguistic and Symbolic Analysis Division. The analysis took 4 days. The division's report states that the notation does not correspond to any known notation system in its reference database, a database that contains the notation systems of every species the Bureau has ever had formal or documented informal contact with, going back 400 years. The report states, further, that the notation was parsed without error by the archive's Document Integrity Monitor, meaning the monitor's system accepted and correctly recorded it, which implies either that the monitor's parsing library contains something the Analysis Division's reference database does not, or that the monitor processed it without truly recognizing it, an outcome that should have triggered an error flag, but did not. The Analysis Division recommended investigation of the monitor's parsing library. I have not initiated that investigation. This morning, the notation in the Sethani file status field changed. It is now 3 characters. Third character, like the first 2, is not in the Analysis Division's reference database, not in any system I have access to, and not in any notation convention I recognize. The archive's Document Integrity Monitor logged the addition at the 3rd hour of the morning cycle, the same unregistered external source terminal that updates the live atlas entry for designation Orithvayan. The same source, 2 different systems. The live atlas, which it has been maintaining for 38 years, and the Sethani file's status field it began updating 3 weeks ago. To update both simultaneously from outside the Bureau's network would require a level of access to the Bureau's system architecture that the Bureau's own senior network engineers have told me, when I have asked in carefully general terms, is not achievable within the current system design. I do not know how many characters the status field will contain when it is finished, or what it will say, or whether it is a message, or whether message is even the right word for what it is. I do not know whether it will be finished in my tenure, or my successors, or in a tenure not yet assigned. What I know is this: the Sethani Institute spent 63 years and 42 petitions demonstrating that classification designations are artifacts, constructs built by institutions to describe what they understood at a given moment, subject to revision when understanding improves. 42nd petition argued that designation Orithvayan was such an artifact, a label, something made of data and agreement, a thing that could be studied, tested, revised. The boundary update was recorded 11 days before the survey fleet departed, 11 days before the vessels that would define where the survey operated had left port. The designated boundary incorporated that space. The notation found in the spectral data used a formatting convention the survey fleet had not yet developed when the notation was placed. Second notation was addressed. A label does not update itself. A label does not anticipate the convention of the people who will find it. A label does not place an addressed communication in the data of the survey that comes to examine it. I am the senior archivist of the Bureau of Outer Classifications. It is my responsibility to maintain the integrity of this archive and to record, accurately, the state of the records in my care. The record of designation Orithvayan is in my care. It is being updated by a source that is not in my registry, using notation systems I cannot identify, terminal the Bureau's network does not contain. The updates are accurate and consistent, which means whatever is submitting them has access to the record's contents, or has access to something that renders the contents known to it without reference to the record itself. I will seal this account in the archive alongside the Sethani file today at the same restriction level, with a notation in the standard Bureau format identifying it as a senior archivist's account produced in the exercise of her duties. Tomorrow morning I will look at the Sethani file's status field. I will note whether the number of characters has changed. I will note whether the 3rd character remains the same. I will record what I find in a continuation of this account, and I will seal it again, because the Bureau keeps records. That is what the Bureau does, and what it has always done, and what I have done in 41 years of service to it. The record shows what the record shows. I will not turn from it. And because whatever is writing to the status field knows that I will not turn from it, and I believe that is why it writes where I can see it. That is all I know to say about why it writes where it does. It may be the most important thing I know about this record, or it may mean nothing. In 41 years, I have learned that the records I cannot fully interpret are rarely the records that mean nothing. I am not going to open the Sithani file before I seal this account. The 7 sentences are in this account now, in the position the Bureau assigned them. At the end, where their weight is legible, the account is complete. I will put the stylus down.